That takes us to our discussion agenda, which will go to item 20, proposed revisions to board policy JFABF, students in foster care, shown in Exhibit F. Dr. Harris.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Policy JFABF is a new policy that we bring to your attention on tonight, and what I'll do is simply try to highlight what is found within the confines of this particular policy, and then try to respond to any questions you might have. It simply begins with acknowledging that this is a collaborative effort made by and between the school district and the state of South Carolina's Department of Social Services. And basically, the policy just simply ensures that there is little to minimal disruption in the event that students are placed into foster care. It further goes on to indicate that when those cases do occur, and they do arise, that students are provided equal access to programs and activities as well as educational services that are provided by the school district. There are a list of at least 3 different definitions that kind of define exactly some of the terms that you will hear in terms like foster care, school of origin, and additional costs. There is a district point of contact, which we have identified by way of Ms. Jennifer Felkel, who is our coordinator for parenting and social work services here, I think is still in the audience. And it also indicates and talks about placement and the placement process, which she, in this particular case, in collaboration and in conjunction with Department of Social Services representative or representatives will collaborate to ensure that proper placement of students who are placed in foster care is provided here in our district. Certainly notifying all key stakeholders as well, such as principals, psychologists, or whomever it might be. And there's a list of different things to consider if you look at the top of page 2, different things to consider as it relates to that process. As with policies such as this, there are times, very few in my experience, where there are disputes with or differences of opinion regarding placement. And this policy simply indicates that in that event, then the respective parties, our school district and the Department of Social Service will in turn go to their leads, if you will, the Department of Education and or the Department of Social Services for guidance and direction. However, in the end, should that be the case and there is a dispute, then Department of Social Services, according to federal guidance, does reserve the right to make the final call. They are the final arbiter in those particular cases. There's an information regarding transportation costs, and it also talks about record keeping, which is the responsibility of a particular school district. This is a policy that follows very similar to that of students who are identified as McKinney-Vento, which is referenced in this policy. But this is a new policy that we're recommending. Following that, there is JFABF E1 and JFABF E2 are both documents that are to be utilized and given consideration in the placement of students. It is a best interest form as well as a form that refers to the immediate enrollment, how we go about enrolling students who are identified as in foster care placement. That's the policy that we have before you, along with the accompanying attachments regarding foster care, placement of foster care students.
Any questions? Mr. Cates.
It appears the policies were probably spurred by some changes in federal and state law, so I appreciate you keeping us in compliance there. Was South Carolina School Board Association model policies also used in drafting of these?
This is the model policy from, exactly right, and I apologize, it failed to recognize that. This is the model policy from the School Boards Association.
Thank you.
Mr. Lovelace.
Mr. Harris, under the bullet points on page 2 in the first sentence, it talks about transfer to school of residence, and that's, can you tell me, I mean, that's not identified in there, you know, the school of residence. What does that mean?
And your school of residence is, you have a couple things. One called the school of origin and then the school of residence.
That one was identified in the definition.
Right.
The other one wasn't.
The school of residence would actually be, in this case, the school in which the student was coming from.
Okay.
Exactly. Well, let me back up. The school in which the student will be attending, I'm sorry. The
Okay.
school of origin is where they're coming from.
Okay, I get you.
Right.
And the second thing, you mentioned it, but I don't know what that is, the McKinney-Vento staff, what does that mean?
That's correct. That's a federal law, McKinney-Vento Homeless Education Act is what that is. And it follows very similar to what I've described here in foster care, whereby it's a policy enacted back in 1986, I believe it was, under then former President Ronald Reagan, who identified this and indicated that students who deemed to be identified as homeless would not have barriers to their education, and school districts such as ours and across the country would make provisions to ensure their enrollment, is what that simply says.
Very well-written policy statement, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Ms. Hammond?
I have experience having, a student in my class that's foster care. I'm really glad to see that at the end of the student's foster care placement, he or she will be permitted to remain enrolled in the receiving school until the end of the academic year, if appropriate. Is that more of a thing we can decide as the school district, or is that done by the DSS services? Because that's so important, where a child,
I agree with you,
gets
that's very
accepted
important.
there. Yeah, and then they've
And-
got to move.
And it is a collaborative decision or determining factor by the school district, as well as, in this particular case, the representative or representatives from Department of Social Services.
Well-
Typically what happens, or they do tend to yield or lend themselves to the determining decisions by the school district.
So like, say, if it was, they were moved from the foster care and then transportation was a problem, like where, say, buses didn't run for that, but the good of the child would be to stay in our district, does DSS in the state give us some transportation or help us with that with the child?
Unfortunately not.
Yeah, I was afraid of that.
Again, very similar to that of the McKinney-Vento Homeless
Yeah.
Education Act. Unfortunately not. That is that is a cost that the school districts throughout the state have to incur.
Have to incur.
And we are to work collaboratively across districts to ensure that we minimize costs where and when
Right.
possible.
Thank you, because I do know, I was just glad to see that in there. I didn't know how much leeway we really had to enforce it.
Absolutely.
Any other comments or questions? These will be coming back for first readings and so forth in the coming weeks, meeting. All right, that takes us to item number 21, which is proposed revisions to the student absences and excuses policy shown in Exhibit G.
Okay, thank you. This particular policy, JHR, student absences and excuses, is in reference to making certain that we are providing opportunities for students when they are absent to make up work, and also to be accountable and responsible where and when students, if they are found to be deemed truant, habitually truant, and/or chronically truant. There are really just two things in this particular policy that I wanted to bring to your attention, and again, it makes us, places us in line with the School Boards Association recommendations. There on that first page, I've highlighted the language of intervention plan. Heretofore, what we began as we looked at this particular policy and this particular rule is something called an attendance improvement plan, which is simply a contract that we would utilize there at the schools to ensure that students are attending school as they should. What we know in reference to attendance-related issues is that there are oftentimes a number of different issues related to why students are not attending. So to intervene, it was found to be more appropriate, so an intervention plan would be determined, and so we've tried to highlight that throughout. That's one simple change that occurred. But the second change was really found on page 3 of that particular document at the top, where it talks about makeup work. There are 3 paragraphs there that are highlighted. In short, it just simply indicates that provisions will be made to acknowledge a student to be allowed to make up missed assignments, as well as to ensure that they are requiring in terms of the attendance requirement, that they are there in terms of seat time, And that can be done whether it's after school, whether it's during weekends, or if it existed during extended year programs. It further talks about the time frame in which makeup work should be made, which parents and students make contact with teachers, and the duration in which the work has to be made which is within a 10-day period. There are extenuating circumstances, as we know, does occur from time to time, And that window, a 10-day window, can be extended to 30 days, should it be the case, and/or prior to the start of the subsequent new school year. So that, in short, is the additional language that we've placed here under makeup work as it relates to this particular policy, student absences and excuses.
Questions on this proposed policy?
I have one.
Ms. Hammond?
How do we implement the seat time in our schools? Is it like after school, and then they just make up the hours in any work? Or is it done, it has to be done before the last day of school to get credit for?
Primarily, it's done either after school or weekends. It's primarily what it's done. So there's a time frame in which schools will identify, and there's a period or window of opportunity for students to make up that time, that seat time, and that's done at our local high schools.
And it may vary from high school to high school. Do they ever do a Saturday? Do they?
It has been done before. It has been. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Mr. Cates?
Dr. Harris, I thank you for the policy. Sometimes when we look at these policies in isolation, we forget they're a part of a bigger body of work. And as a parent, I know when I had a son that had suffered a concussion and had to go through some return to classroom, and there were multiple policies that kind of impacted the way he was treated, which was exceptionally well. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but is there a way when we look at these policies to kind of reference some of those other places? For example, a parent had a child that was concussed, has been absent. They look at this policy and think this is the only policy that would guide that absence, where there really are others based on a student assistance team, 504. There are myriad of ways to address absences beyond this. And I know it gets difficult because as the policies change, and you have to go back and see where they're referenced. But if not in the policy, maybe in an index, something to give parents some guidance to the number of policies or options that they may have for a student that is absent, primarily for medical reasons.
Okay. Thank you for that, Mr. Cates. I'll certainly begin to look at how I can include that for the first reading, so at least give an idea or a good sampling of where parents might be able to find other policies. Be glad to do that.
Ms. Hutchison?
Dr. Harris, does this include, I don't see it written down there, but how do we handle habitual tardiness? I think I first learned about this in an elementary school where the principal told me that I was asking about attendance and was told that, sometimes there's children that miss the first 30, 45 minutes of school virtually every day. And so how can you help me out with that, explain that process to us?
Absolutely. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start, and then I'm going to toss it to Ms. Brown, who is our student services officer who handles this on a daily basis. But let me start it by saying this. That really falls in line with what's called the chronic absenteeism, which was implemented last year. And it's still fairly new, and we're still trying to make certain that we are bringing all of our parents and our schools on board with understanding exactly what that means. In short, you're absolutely right. Every minute counts is what happens. And indeed, after a period of time, if there are enough absences, tardies, or whatever the case might be, that does go against a student. And so perhaps I can ask her to kind of give you a little, just a deeper walk into what that simply means to us.
Thank you.
So addressing with tardies, or the time that instruction is lost when students are coming late to school, is that chronic absenteeism discussion comes into play with our families. And with chronic absenteeism, it talks about and tracks every minute that a student is missing instruction. And so when we call parents in, whether it's with tardies or absences, we can develop an attendance intervention plan to address either issue. And part of that comes the chronic absenteeism discussion, where we can run a report and say when they're coming 30, 45 minutes late every day, here's the amount of instruction time that is lost. And so it adds a lot of meat and substance to that conversation with parents. So that allows us to address the tardiness with elementary schools, middle, and high schools, just to have that tracking system in place for our students and our families.
Is that, is tardiness something that if, in our policies perhaps, where a parent could read about it and say, oh, okay, it's important that I get my child to school because it's going to count against
Yeah.
their attendance?
One of the things that we have been discussing across the board with all of our registrars, our attendance clerks, and administrations is just building the awareness, whether that's in parent workshops, whether that's at the beginning of PTO meetings, whether that's in brochures, whether that's in the student agenda book or in our code of conduct, whether we tweet it out and put it on social media, but the more attention that we can draw to families being aware that every minute counts. If you saw in September, it was National Attendance Month, and so that was one of the things that we wanted to establish with parents and our families, of doing a D5 every day, of just setting the routine and the expectations and the value of students attending on time every day. So that's something that we're continuously monitoring. Schools are monitoring that on a weekly basis and calling parents in to really stay proactively addressing that and having a proactive approach on that.
Thank you.
Question? Mr. Harris, I did have one follow-up. Under the approval of absences in excess of 10 days, are we making efforts to ensure, and you may have already touched on part of this, that we're being consistent among all our schools? And we tend to think of that as being a middle or a high school, but it's probably throughout the school system. But what are we doing to ensure, maybe the tracking part, that we're being consistent, or that we're administering along consistent lines to help everyone have an equal consideration? And there are lots of ways you can be excused or not excused, but 10 absences roll up pretty quick. I think of a high school on an A-B schedule, you could miss an awful lot of school in 10 absences, an awful lot, depending on the days you miss. But just tell me sort of what we're doing for consistency throughout our system.
I think the greatest thing is keeping it in front of our people, keeping it in front of our administrators and our students alike. I think it's probably the greatest thing we can possibly do. We have several different workshops and different things that we do with our administrators to make certain that they are in tune and aware of any changes that might come down from the state, for example. I have think tank groups, think tank opportunities. We put in resource roundup communications that go out to administrators, registrars, other people who have any hands or have any involvement with absences or attendance-related matters. And we, again, as we just heard just a few months ago, just make sure that our parents and students are aware. So I think that's really our greatest strength, in just keeping it in front of the people is really the greatest strength.
Thank you. Thank you for the effort. Mr. Cates.
And maybe to help with some clarity within the policy, as a parent of an elementary student, we thought of absences more about missing a day,
Right.
And then as a parent of a high schooler, it's a class, leaving early.
Right.
And I know when my son is absent, because we have registered so many phone numbers and emails, I get 5 calls, 3 emails, and a personal visit, I'm pretty sure. I mean, but not so much for tardy. And if tardiness is an issue, then maybe we need to look at that same kind of communication when a student is tardy as well. Now, I look in Power School, which I think is the best invention in the world. My children, not so much. But, but I mean, we're able to, if you know, and you can access the information. But the reality is, not everybody is aware of that. And if we have a system to notify on absences, and tardiness is a concern because that is an absence, you're absent from seat time, maybe we need to look at similar notifications. My son's going to really love me for that suggestion.
Thank you, Mr. Cates.
Mr. Gann,
Yes, ma'am.
I would just say, as far as tardies for classes, it really lies at the hands of the administrator in the school building with tardy policies and the consequences that the school has. So I would, and I don't know if that's the same for like all our high schools and all, but tardies are something, you know, that a teacher does have to deal with. And that's kind of where, to me, it first starts as far as knowing how important. Now, if it's a tardy, like where they're not even at the school building, that's different. But with your classes, I think it's like Mr. Harris said, or Dr. Harris, it's being proactive in talking about tardies and the importance. Even a kid that's just wandering in the hall and they're 5 minutes to your class, like they're still missing instructional time. So it's almost like tardies have to be handled all the way from the teacher and the classroom, you know, all the way to the administration. So I do think consequences are the key.
Right.
And if anybody figures out the way to, some kids that can't drive yet, they're late because of their parents.
Right.
So if you can get to the parent and y'all find the cure for that, be sure you tell us, because you will be a wealthy person. Seriously, we can't control the parent.
That's exactly right. That's why the intervention plans are so critical, because it's an opportunity to engage parents and to make certain that we bring to their attention how
Important.
even tardiness impacts a student's growth and opportunity toward his or her student achievement. So you're absolutely right.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the things I appreciate about all of our schools is we communicate so much and provide an opportunity for them to share so that we operate the same way, regardless of the school building. We look at our code of conduct and we share notes and make sure that what we're doing at one school is the same that we're doing
Right.
across the board for consistency.
That's good. Thank you.
It's been great discussion on this. Probably need to move on to number 22, which is proposed revisions to the tobacco use by students policy shown in Exhibit H.
Okay, very good. Policy JICG, in reference to tobacco use by students, has some new language, again, from our School Boards Association, and it really emphasizes and stresses the need for having a 100% tobacco-free environment. And it also talks about how important it is that we ensure that no students in this particular case either use or possess tobacco products or tobacco paraphernalia. There is a particular goals that are new here that talks about, again, the smoke-free environment, and the fact that it is specific to all district buildings, facilities, vehicles owned, leased, rented, or chartered by the school district. And it is also applicable at all school, sponsored and/or school-related events on or off school grounds. I thought that's a new information. Procedurally, it talks about prohibiting the use of or possession of tobacco products and paraphernalia, again, like smokers' tobacco, snuff, alternative nicotine products, e-cigarettes, and so forth, by all persons, student, staff, contract workers, or visitors. And there's an enforcement, which bodes well with our student discipline code, to kind of give me an idea in terms of a progressive discipline approach as to how we handle tobacco use or tobacco paraphernalia with students. Educationally, making certain that we are providing effective tobacco use prevention curricula, and identifying the fact that we are not, and this is again new, that we are not accepting any contributions, gifts, nor participating in services that are funded by tobacco industry, and that the promotion of paraphernalia is not allowed on school campuses or school-related activities or sponsored events. And that is new language and jargon here for the policy JICG, tobacco use by students.
Mr. Cates?
Dr. Harris, do you believe in the procedures paragraph where it addresses e-cigarettes? Do you think that language is clear, concise, broad enough to cover Juuls, vaping, all of those activities that we want to be crystal clear that's a part of that? Is that a broad enough term, e-cigarettes?
Alternative nicotine products, from a technical sense, that sounds preferred, but we certainly can spell that out. I think that's probably how I want to
I
respond
mean,
to
it'll
that.
probably change every year, but
Probably
what they
will.
call it. And then in the next bullet point, does the South Carolina Department of Health, Environmental Control, and the Department of Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse Services, and the Department of Education, does that curriculum now include the e-cigarettes, Juuls, vaping, as a part of that awareness and education piece.
It includes that, as well as our comprehensive health education also includes that, and there's a lot of content, I think is the word I want to use, that's involved with each of those, as well as opioids has also been included in that as well.
Thank you. Questions, comments?
I got one quick one.
Okay.
How about a high school kid that wants to wear a T-shirt that's, advertising Camel cigarettes? That would go against that policy.
According to this new
That's what I'm-
recommendation, that
yeah.
is correct.
Good.
Ms. Hutchison?
Dr. Harris, I was, I guess, comparing this policy to the next one that we're going to be talking about,
Right.
ADC.
Right.
And the one that we're talking about right now, JICG, we talk about it, is called tobacco use by students, but then we do talk about other people. So it's really, basically, I'm wondering if it would be more appropriate to call that tobacco-free school district. I know that they're in different places. The J policies, are those for,
Specific to students?
yes,
Exactly right, and you're exactly right, Ms. Hutchinson, that the ADC, which would be next, is, the language is pretty much the same.
Right.
The only difference is that it does include staff, contract, or other workers and visitors. Exactly, that's the one change in the two policies. And you're right, they are found in different places for that reason.
well, now, unless maybe I'm reading this wrong, but in JICG, under goals, we talk about as a smoke-free environment for all students, staff, contract, and other workers and visitors. So don't we use that same language in ADC?
We do?
So I see what we're doing is we're making sure that this, if you're looking it up for students or if you're looking it up for any other reason that you would want to, we're covering our bases. I'm wondering if it would be a better title, since it's not just covering students. I know it's for students, but I kind of like the phrase tobacco-free better than tobacco use. Something about it, just tobacco use is implying, it's just it's a more positive to say tobacco-free. Plus, we're not, since we start talking about staff and everybody else in the student section, then it makes more sense because we're more inclusive by that title.
Okay.
I hope that's not nitpicking too much, but
Not at all. I see where you are with that.
okay.
And, so I think that's easy fix.
Good points. Any other points? Good time to move to item number 23. We're already talking about it a little bit,
Yeah.
which is
Just
our
did it.
tobacco-free workplace and schools. So you want to touch it a little bit, we'll talk about it a little bit.
What Ms. Hutchinson said. What we have, the policies are very similar, ADC as well as JICG. The one difference is the information that this ADC includes contract workers, visitors, as what, yes, it includes those persons who are obviously not students. I mean, that's the one change that's there.
Any comments, questions? Seeing none, we will then move to item number 24, and knowing that every one of these provisions is coming back for action in the ensuing week. I'd entertain a motion to adjourn. Ms. Hutchison,
I move that we adjourn.
have a second. Mr. White seconds. And I would say before we adjourn, congratulations to all the people born in tonight. Looking forward to serving the students and community together. And with that, I'd like to say, all those in favor, please raise your hand. And Ms. Garden, do you have your hand up to adjourn?
I sure do.
Okay, I know it's been a long
She told
time
me,
on the
yeah.
phone, but thank you. We're looking forward to the next meeting. We'll have your ceremonial swearing in and bring lots of friends and family. Thank you.
I will. Thank you so much for doing this for me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. And good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you,
Good
sir.
night, Ms. Gardner.
It was an honor. I enjoyed it.